Hi, Emergent.
Hey, how we doing, Jason?
Good, sir. When I first kind of glommed onto this idea and sort of to toss it out there in some GCs and VCs and all the other Cs out there, I was hit initially with a lot of pushback because this idea of a AI Congress, I think, hits people in the fields. No, that's not how government works. That's not. We will not be replaced by robots and technology. I'm like, I think we already have. And now we're just formalizing the process more and more because for the last, let's say 20 years at least, if not more, our inputs have all come from certain sources, and those inputs are curated. And that's not just for us on the ground, but that's also for our representatives and and people in government. I mean, look, one of the standard narratives around Trump is that Trump, didn't know things, and we want to fix that. I think because we're now dealing with systems and with technology that gets really, really scary.
Oh, sure. And to that point, here's a quick segue. I think is sensible. So one of the background materials I think that I like to cite on these conversations about government and roles. One of my favorite, very underrated macro historian is Brooks Adams. He was the grandson of founding father John Adams, and he wrote a really underrated book in 1896 called The Law of Civilization and Decay. And in it, people think of government as, oh, well, it's the monopoly on violence or force. It's kind of about people is the most obvious thing that people think. But he wrote that government actually comprises 4 different monopolies. And he called them knowledge, violence, land/property. Of course, at the time, it was mostly land. But now we have intellectual property. We have virtual property. We have vehicles, things like that. We have stock options or property, even though it's not a physical thing. And then we have currency. So knowledge, violence, land, and currency. So even within that, you can see, to your point, if there is a deep state or if there is an intelligence agency that is hoarding the key information needed to make the real decisions or to know what's really going on, if they are hoarding that to themselves, then they are exercising a form of government power.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think also this idea that, when we talk about compartmentalization, right? The buzzword for a little bit was decentralization. And everyone was really hot on this idea of decentralization. And I was like, decentralization is fine and good when a system is problematic and you got to tear it apart and find out exactly, it's like a carburetor. You want to pull it apart and find out which part isn't working and then fix that part. But ultimately, you kind of want to move towards centralization in order for civilization to work, because you can't have 5 different forms of, road repair going on at the same time. Even the information you're gathering, while it might come from a lot of different sources, you do have to centralize them into an action plan. That's just how humans do. So there's, again, this idea of where are we getting this information? Is the information we're getting good, or is it being hijacked by other actors who may or may not have our best interests at heart? And I would say, by and large, now we're being infiltrated by outside actors. Maybe we'll do this. We'll set out standard forms of analog government. So, and by that definition, I mean the government we have so far and how it was set up. I'll toss that to you, but in the standard form, you have the problem of distance. So people living in different parts of the country, they can't all get together and vote on things all the time. Plus, they're busy. They're farmers. They're people. They're landowners. Whatever the distinction is, they got stuff to do. They don't have time to stop everything and go cast a vote on every little thing.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, you mentioned decentralization. Like, some people push it as desirable, and there's cases where it is. But there's actually a very famous problem in crypto called the blockchain trilemma, and it is said that basically it is difficult, if not impossible, for a blockchain to simultaneously be all 3 of these things: secure, scalable, and decentralized. In other words, decentralization comes at the cost of either scalability or security. So, and then there may be, if we can't trust anything, right, then maybe we will sacrifice scalability to get security and decentralization, right? But again, it's a trade-off. You're sacrificing one thing for another. And I think in a similar vein, our form of representative government really is kind of that trade-off, and it was made for kind of a different age with a high trust society. So when foundationally every government is on the most basic level, it is a legitimizing consensus mechanism for societal decisions. So let's just take the example of we all understand the concept of killing, but how do we sort out murder from accident, from self-defense, from legitimate war casualty or capital punishment? All of these are acts of killing, but the purpose of government is so that we have a reliable mechanism that we can reach consensus on which of those is which, and we're avoiding unnecessary conflict. So basis of representative government is, and part of it's a physical limitation. In the days of founding fathers, you had, for example, the Electoral College, because it was physically impossible for 50,000 people to get together and vote and then travel to the Capitol and cast their votes individually. So you elected a representative whose job was to get on horseback and go and represent, those people. So you're kind of sacrificing that decentralization in order to get the security and the scalability, because representative government is what lets you scale a government to a larger geographic area and still be reasonably secure that this is the legitimately representing of the people that elected it.
And to your point, let's say we select Bob. So we're part of this community. We all follow the same religion. We all come from the same, let's say, ethnic group or cultural group. There's, of course, differences between each persona, differences of opinion, but they're more or less novel. They're not foundational. So we can select Bob as maybe the guy who wants to do the job, or who's the best at doing the job, or maybe he's the fastest at getting to DC, or whatever hell criteria we want to place on it. And we send Bob because Bob is really a representative of us. And we can feel confident that Bob's going to represent us because Bob is us. He's an avatar, essentially, of our community. I think that's when we talk about high trust societies and the importance of it, and even in centralization, right? This idea of individuality comes into play as well. Because yes, we can argue that Bob as a person is an individual unto himself, but he's also a representative of a collective.
There's also kind of we're trying to build a modern civilization, and another reason we want representative government is because we want specialization. We want people to specialize and be a doctor. We want a doctor to be able to cast a vote and hopefully elect somebody who is a good representative of him, and then go back to treating patients, right? We want an engineer to be able to do the same thing. So another function of representative government is that it allows, the citizenry to, in some sense, kind of elect and then forget, for the most part, not spend all of their time voting on their phones for the latest the latest bill and reading the 70,000 pages. History goes through cycles where government becomes a very forgettable thing, and then you go through cycles where everybody has to care about government because it's a matter of survival and stability and perhaps even life and death. And I think this is one of these generational disconnects I encounter all the time. Again, one of those contrasting perspectives is that a lot of folks of the over 50, over 60 generation, boomers, kind of grew up in a time where government was a little bit more on the forgettable side. And I hear all the time from Gen Z, from millennials who say, what are we doing waiting for Washington, for people in DC to find a solution to this? We need a solution now. I can't pay my bills. So there's a very big contrast there between the need for this sit back and forget type of government versus something that's a lot more responsive and that's faster. We now live in an internet age where the world changes at an unprecedented rate, and that may be one of the things that drives some kind of adoption or drive towards an AI based or AI enhanced government, is because we want something. There is a demand for something more responsive.
Yeah, which gets us into the conversation of layers of government. Because what I think, starting with JFK, really, well, and maybe even in World War II as well, because you had movies and all of a sudden the president went from just a general leader who was important, but could also just be kind of forgettable in some cases, unless you're in war, suddenly became a movie star. Now an incredible amount of attention was given to the federal government versus your local municipal government. The distinction I think it has to be made is that for the majority of people, your concern should be much more on your municipal government and less so on your federal. There's an overemphasis on the federal and a decreasing emphasis on the municipal until a tragedy like the fires in LA happen. And then suddenly your municipal government and all the functions within that municipal government become really, really freaking important, right? Like,
oh, absolutely.
We're seeing even with the Palisades Mall is a great example of the owner who had a private fire department for the Palisades Mall and had his own tankers and all that stuff. And the Palisades Mall is fine. Everything else around it for blocks are burnt down, completely destroyed, but the mall is good. But I think that's the disconnect. Everyone keeps calling on Washington to make all these changes. And while it can make a whole bunch of changes, it's going to affect everyone across the board. Not all states are equal. Not all states have the same concerns. Certainly the same rules shouldn't be applied to every single state. That's, I don't think, how it was originally designed anyways. And now we're starting to see that return to the conversation of states' rights, almost that sort of Yarvin style patchwork system starting to emerge, where I think if this trend keeps going, we're going to see almost a return of neo-city states. Just in terms of data, we're collecting data, and data in this sense, I just mean information. And this is the bridge into the digital. The old analog system is that you're collecting this data through institutions, people who are put into management positions whose job is to get this data, analyze it, put it together into a package, create a budgetary need, work assessment, whatever. That's obviously broken down completely.
I think a very important part of that is that as Brooks Adams says, that first monopoly, that monopoly on knowledge is breaking down, right? Because for so many years, particularly in the United States, but in the West in general, is that ended up being concentrated. You used to have kind of local news stations where they were different, and your local news anchor talked more relatably to the issues in the local area, but they would comment on national issues. But then eventually you had large media conglomerates, and then eventually you had the centralization of media into really kind of the prime narrative consensus apparatus. And a process that I began to observe probably circa the mid to late 90s, but leading in, and it started to accelerate into the 2000s. And then really where I think it hit the exponential growth was in 2008 with the accessibility of mobile phones. You just saw certain types of things go, and maybe one of the first examples of that was things like Occupy Wall Street. It's just kids getting on their phones and saying, okay, we all have this big gripe about the banks and the corporations in the 2008 crisis. Let's all go out to a park and raise a ruckus about it. And of course, that wasn't particularly effective in the long run, but it immediately introduced this new model of dynamically gather a group for a protest, as opposed to the old model, which was, well, we'll go get some funding, we'll go buy a brick and mortar, we'll go set up in City Hall. You needed a more formal organization. But now we saw things start to break down. And I think what we've been looking at over the last 20 to 24 years is a gradual and then sudden and then accelerating, and the absolute dam bursting moment of that first monopoly breaking down is the moment that Elon bought Twitter and just opened the floodgates.
You and media now.
Yeah. And what we've seen since then is now think about 6 months ago, the mainstream, they sounded so confident in themselves, and whatever we say goes. And I even knew people that didn't believe a word they said, but who would go around and argue, oh, well, it's inevitable, everybody will believe what they says. And really, if you're arguing power onto somebody you disagree with, you are giving them power. I find it, but now you listen to them and they sound so demoralized. It sounds like they know that the power they used to have is gone. It's not coming back. And I think there really is a sense so in terms of government, that's a huge societal change. And I don't think we have yet to appreciate the full ramifications of that. And like you're saying, this feeds into AI, because I know a number of folks, because I go way back in crypto and a lot of these DAO communities. And there's now a race on different, lots of different organizations making their own small, medium, and large scale AI tools. I think there will be a purpose for large scale, very general purpose AI tools, but I think there will also be a purpose for more specialized ones or things that really relate to a particular community. I mean, I think Balaji even had an example in the network state where he said, well, there are Catholics who are unhappy with the Catholic Church. And some of them said, well, if we disagree with the corruption in the Catholic Church, why don't we make an AI version of the Bible and we'll make an AI Pope?
Oh, Jesus.
Which sounds like a crazy idea, but they took it seriously. As far as I know, there actually is a movement to say, well, if you have something, when you have a real person or figurehead, there always is the risk of corruption, right? Or them inserting their personal agenda too much into that representative role. And so this kind of goes to the notion of what if we had a virtual representative for Congress? Well, in theory, if a group of citizens from one voting district got together and said, okay, well, we're going to make an AI model. We'll make an open source AI model that will contribute. Anybody can, it will have the equivalent of input, will be like calling your congressman. Let me put my values, let me put my issues, let me put these things. And what if this model could be trained to add up everybody's concerns, weight them all, and create this hybrid model of saying, okay, well, now this virtual representative can go and speak for you. But unlike the actual physical congressman you send, he can't end up on the Epstein list. It's immune to lobbyists. In theory, it could be an improvement. I mean, there's obviously things that can go wrong too, but in theory, you could end up with a huge improvement by being able to cut out some of the corrupting influence.
The obvious trade-off here is common denominator, right? It's almost like sensitivity filters. How sensitive to the individual does the AI or algorithm need to be? Say you're taking a district in New York City, and let's say we're talking about 10,000 people, right? Just to give just as a number. Again, since we don't have the same mechanisms we did 200 or 300 years ago.
Oh, and by the way, the number on that is the 2020 census. The average district is about 750,000 people represented by one congressman. Okay, and there's states where it varies a little or less.
So I'm being hyper conservative. I'm Canadian living in Australia. Like 700,000 is like half the population of. so, but you know what I'm saying is like whatever the number is, and when we get into hundreds of thousands, it gets even more mashugana. But now we're getting to this idea that we have the decentralization of a community has already happened. So now we can't even say that a community or a district is operating of a similar interest, other than we start saying very broad interests. This is where we get into distinctions without difference, where we're just talking like, well, yeah, people want success. Well, what is success? Well, they want money. Okay, but what is, like, how much money to do what with? Like, what's the objective here? Well, they need to own a house. Okay, but what kind of house? Like, and like, if you start getting granular on any of these kind of general desires, then you're met with almost an impossible array of what would be the common denominator. And I guess that's the fear, is that AI says, well, everyone needs a home, so we'll just build these big giant megaplexes, and we're going to be living in Judge Dredd world, because I mean, look, the one of the issues I think with AI in general is I think AI is extremely feminine, and this is a Charles Padil idea, end quote. Is that the feminine is actually very practical and pragmatic. The masculine is romantic. So the more feminine a society gets, the more pragmatic it gets, which is why I believe we have a whole bunch of gray concrete boxes. Now, those gray concrete boxes might be designed by men and built by men and okayed by men, but the desire to make a featureless cement box for building is hyper pragmatic, therefore feminine in this example, right? In this context.
And the Soviet Union was full of that type of architecture, right?
Sovietism was one of the most feminine coded ideologies I think that has ever existed. Communism in general.
And that's a fascinating point there. And I'd love to add something very quick to that. And the dividing line really is 2008 with the introduction of the first iPhone and shortly thereafter the first Android phones. The reason that's such an important point is because the internet obviously existed prior to that, but you came home from work and you would log onto it in the evening. It It was more of you had to direct your focus at it. With the advent of smartphones, now the internet is ever present in your pocket, and it's ubiquitous. And they've done there's all of this data out there about things like dating apps and how dating preferences started to change from that. Social media, you get things like, kids get on apps, and then you kind of have the advent of wokeism on websites like Tumblr. And all of a sudden this, some of this overblown gender ideology just takes root at the same time in a lot of young minds. But something along the lines there that I observed very early on is I noticed, even before we reached that 2008 point, I remember noticing that my average male friend on social media tended to have anywhere from maybe 150 to 100 or a couple hundred, maybe 500, friends on their social media profiles. And these tended to be people, for the most part, everybody on there was somebody they worked with, somebody they went to school with, someone they served in the military with, somebody they had a real connection to. But I would look on my female friends' social media profiles, and they'd have 500, 2,500, 7,000, 10,000, 12,000 friends, right? There is something in versus masculine and feminine psychology where men tend to create focused social connections that serve a specific purpose, and women tend to collect a lot of weak social connections that are more general in nature, right? More like collecting influence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the feminine tries to create consensus, because consensus is actually, I think, a safety mechanism where you want to be agreeable with the most amount of people so that you're not in danger. A more masculine impulse is to be the outsider, to be the person who stands up and goes, that doesn't work for me, brother.
Be prepared to compete.
Exactly. Right. The competitive urge means that, we just take it down to two people, right? The classic mano a mano kind of fight. That is, you're almost building consensus through competition. So whoever wins is right. That's just how it goes, right? Like if, we're disagreeing on what to have for lunch, and I beat the crap out of you, we're eating what I said we're going to eat for lunch. Like, that's just what's going to happen. That's kind of my other concern with this, with AI. We're building better data models to create this consensus, whether it is accurate or contrived, but the consensus making mechanism and to act purely from consensus is an overtly feminine trait. Now, does that mean it's wrong or bad or evil? Not necessarily.
There's cases where it's good.
Of course. And you do need, like we just said in the early part of the conversation, like you do need centralization in order to create an action plan. Consensus could be that centralization, right? You're creating a consensus of ideas and information into one actionable data point and go, okay, all the data is telling us to do this, therefore we will do that. That's fine. At some point, the internet turned from an information providing technology to an information harvesting technology.
Sure.
And I think when we got to Cambridge Analytica, and I don't think enough attention was really given to that, although there was a lot of attention, but I think the attention given was the wrong attention. And now, of course, Mark Zuckerberg is doing his whole redemption arc here.
We're trying to
desperately, and I think he's gonna more or less win out with that. His mentor is Peter Thiel, so we'll see how that plays out. But I think he's going to be more successful than not. And I don't believe that Mark didn't know what the heck was going on with that. I think he did, and just turned a blind eye.
I think
it's possible, but
I think you could in terms of how we frame this conversation so far, I think you could put it as Mark knew he was up against a powerful set of actors who controlled the first monopoly, knowledge, and he didn't want to go up against them in a fight. And now that Elon came along and absolutely not only engaged that fight but won it, now Mark he's willing to do the same thing. Now that the waters are safe.
Yeah, in a Girardian sense, Elon provided the model, and now there's going to be many people modeling Elon in one way or another. But okay, let's go back to Cambridge Analytica, because Cambridge Analytica don't know what I'm talking about or who've forgotten about it. Basically, it was giving out like these little quizzes, for example, personality quizzes. Take the personality quiz. Find out find out what friend's character you really like. And people do these things on Facebook all the time. It was a big trend. The people behind those apps were collecting people's data. I think when people hear data, they're like, my name, my address, my bank account, all that stuff, which is part of it. But it can just be your clicks. It can be, how long you spend on something, how long it takes you to click on an answer, which answers you tend to prefer. Do you like the color, do you like to respond to color blue more than color red? All that kind of stuff. That's all data sets. And those can be compiled and used for the most, general use is marketing. But then when you get into AI and all these other kinds of data sets, well, then that's almost compiling AI personalities. That's the other distressing kind of avenue where this kind of veers into. I want to just reiterate to people, I'm not advocating for any of this stuff, and I'm not against it either. We're in this weird neutral zone of looking at this just as it is, what we can discern was happening, was already happening, what we can extrapolate and figure out what could happen in 6 months, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, and what that could mean for us. Like and again, depending on where you're at with it, maybe it's the most fantastic thing in the world. Maybe Mark Andreessen and Horowitz really are the most nicest human beings on the face of the planet, and they're going to use WorldCoin and your ocular data when they scan your eyeball, just like Minority Report. I pray for it all the time. And
it's all happening. It really is. It's all happening whether we like it or not. So we need to be forward thinking and consider the ramifications. I have a lot of friends across the political spectrum, and one of the biggest critiques that I throw at my conservative friends is I kind of joke that trying to get conservatives to embrace new ideas is kind of like dragging a cat across the rug with its claws dug in.
Right. Whereas with progressives, you can get them to adopt a new idea in
like that.
The problem
right.
is they spend no time of thought about what this new idea is or the consequences of said idea.
Sure.
It's just like, no, but it's new and cool and sexy. It's like, yeah, and it's going to enslave you.
Liberals tend to be open to new information. They tend to be open to new ideas and want to try and embrace things. It often works better when the liberal mindset diagnoses problems and where and what should be done, and conservatives go, okay, let me construct a functional way to do that doesn't dismantle society. And for whatever reason, I think modern liberals have become way too open. I think this is one of those side effects of the internet, is we used to have a better balance of this. Modern liberals are way too open. They go on Tumblr and they, I have 68,000 gender pronouns. And conservatives tend to, I want to go on r/the Donald, or I want to go on a conservative website and kind of regurgitate some of the same content. And there's nothing wrong with that to a point. You were talking about the AI and the training data. A very important thing that I noticed is that, like I said, my male friends tended to have smaller numbers of close contacts. My female friends tended to have larger numbers of loose contacts on social media. And I think there's a side effect of that, is that if you go back to the way our representative governments originally worked, circa 1776, was obviously it was skewed towards the masculine. Not only because men were the only ones with voting rights, obviously, that's a very obvious thing. But even if that weren't the case, nowadays we have, there are women who have 38,000, 500,000 Instagram followers, and they're sharing information and building consensus with that group. But back then it would have been physically impossible for any of them to have that many friends or that much social influence. I mean, you literally to have that much social influence or that many social connections, you would have had to have been royalty or the equivalent thereof. So there is this odd dysmorphic effect with 20th and 21st century communication, is that it has injected more feminine thinking into many areas of society. And men are just now catching up to this in some ways and realizing it and reckoning with it. It was men were much slower on the uptake. And so when we talk about like AI and training data and training sets, you're saying, well, it's kind of feminine. And part of that is because if the average woman has more social connections and posts on social media 500 times a day, and the average man has fewer social connections and posts 8 times a day, it simply is a function of that model being trained with more female data. It's not that there are twice as many. It's not that there are 8 times as many women in society than men. It's that it's receiving 8 times as much communication. So I wonder if a part of this process is finding ways to weight those inputs, because I think a lot of people are starting to come back to the idea that we need to find a better balance, and maybe it is better if we have more masculine decision making in society. But you're going to have to find a way to get to that balance, not just with people, but with the tools we use, like AI tools.
So one of the things I've talked about for the last year and a bit is that we no longer live in a civilization anymore. People poo-poo the idea because they're like, look at all the things we have. And it's like, yes, the modernist always thinks that because we have this wonderful technology and maybe we can make the cars fly or drive by themselves, we live in this futuristic world where tradition and all the things that led us to this point no longer apply. I disagree. I think the tribe remains within us. I think that we're still very much hunter-gatherers in less literal, more symbolic form. AI, or technology up to this point, has been skewed to the gatherer. And we need to inject more of that masculine hunter energy into it as well. So we need to have both a hunter and a gathering society. To exclude one becomes the tyranny of the other. My work with vengeful son, tyrannical father, devouring mother, these kind of archetypes, these responses to tyranny of the previous age. Now that we're into this new age where the offspring of these two other generations of the 20th century is now in full rebellion of not just their parents, which is one point of symbology, not just the masculine and the feminine, which is another layer of examination, but of history itself and all the things that have brought us to this point. Now again, we're in this neutral zone. But if we concentrate solely on AI becoming a gatherer, which I think which is what Grok is, and what AI and large language models have been designed to essentially do, gather information and make a consensus from that information, whether through an image or through an article or research or whatever. Yeah, so maybe if Elon's ever hearing a clip of this, he'll understand that how I see Grok and AI models, how they've been designed, because they've been designed during this devouring mother period, is they're focused on gathering and creating that consensus of data. Whereas we actually need to inject, I think, more of that hunter mentality of not just going out and getting that thing and bringing it back, but something much more aggressive, something that's much more masculine based, much more creative, much more romantic. I don't know what the mechanisms for that would be, but I think once we start to examine what AI art and data cinema can be and how that can be applied, that's where we get that hunter mentality in there. No one creates a great story or an epic around picking berries. But you do about when you kill the mastodon or the big game, or whatever have you. Those are the stories that we sit around the campfire telling. And those are the things that we can build almost culture around. And I think that's what's missing, is that the narrative is really just gathered information, consensus data. Whereas real true stories and epics have to come from that more romantic masculine urge.
Sure. And I think that there is definitely a room, and I definitely know some folks that are working on smaller scale AI models that are more attuned in that direction, where it's not an AI that gathers and builds consensus. The other issue there is it's kind of a signal to noise ratio, right? Just because you've got a lot of data, well, how much of it is nonsense? How much is nonsense and gossip? So I think there is that, but then, like you said, I think there's a very important role for more purpose-driven AIs that are trained to push towards a goal. And I think this is a good moment to kind of pivot back to the Cambridge Analytica thing for a second there. So for those that are listening that aren't familiar exactly, Cambridge Analytica was one of the first ones where they were actually trying to target users, and they were trying to gather as much data as possible, and they were trying to build like a virtual model of that person. Going all the way back to 2000s, late 90s, there were advertising firms that had gathered data. They knew things like Republicans tend to order things in the mail like gun magazines, right? There were ways to predict somebody's political affiliation by what magazines they subscribe to, what restaurants they eat at, what professional associations and memberships, what schools they went to, certain things like that. What car do they drive? There were ways to gather that data, but what Cambridge Analytica introduced is the possibility of not only gathering more of that data, doing it persistently, doing it in very sneaky ways where you don't even know that the data is being collected, but then inserting it into, and sort of the scandal there was that they ended up saying, oh, well, we're going to say if you are a left-leaning person, we will make sure you get all these political ads and things that tell you where to vote. And if you're a right-leaning person, then we'll make sure you get misinformation. And so it introduced the possibility that within a certain margin, you could use this type of tool to manipulate how people vote, right? And people weren't even aware that this was going on. But what I think is interesting about that is in the long term, it really sort of backfired, because it then became public knowledge, and then it became a scandal. And the leftists, the liberals, had a lot of early victories on a lot of these technologies because they were more open to them. But what has slowly happened, and we watch it since 2008, 2010, 2012, first you had the Ron Paul movement, and then you had Trump. Then you had Ron Paul, then you had, in the aftermath of that, you had the preppers, the survivalists, the silver and gold stackers, you had the crypto guys come out of that. Then you had Trump, then you had the end of Trump's first term. Then you had COVID. Then you had the second leading into the second Trump term. And what you have over this longer period of time is you have this built up social momentum and frustration that now masculine energy is converging around. And I think men tend to be very effective when they have a purpose or a goal or something to drive towards. And so there is kind of this short-term victory that they've gotten, but this long-term backlash, which we're still watching, and we're waiting to see the direction that builds in.
Yeah. I mean, specifically is that we're going to see a major economic event in 2025, probably very early. I think the catalyst right now in America is going to be these California fires, but I wouldn't be surprised if all of a sudden you see these insurance claims just start to double and triple. I threw out a number that I think people kind of thought was alarmist, but I'm like, this could easily add up to $1 trillion overnight.
Oh, absolutely.
What do you do then? Right. There's not enough money in the world to support this without crashing other forms of the economy, which again will I think distill people's silliness from the last 20 years of relative peace and prosperity, arguable. Let's not get into defining those terms too much. When your back is to the wall and all of a sudden things start getting, reality starts to assert itself, then you're going to need men who are on quests to fix things. Mm-hmm. The desire for AI Congress that both is transparent to both the public and their representatives to the government itself is going to be a major desire, because people are going to be like, wait a minute, what do you mean you knew about this and didn't do it? That's no longer going to be okay. And the reports we're getting out of California is that this has been a massive red pill moment to a lot of very deep blue, vote blue no matter who people who are now realizing that, oh, we just got fleeced and fucked 5 ways from Sunday here, and now I don't have a house. So that's a very stark realization.
Absolutely.
I think that gives even more credence to this, I think, a generalized desire that's going to emerge for better transparent data, which gets us to the blockchain. Because one of the things we were talking privately about is, so we're spitballing these ideas, like how would this come about if it's going to happen, or when it happens.
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, you said there could be a financial event very early on, and this is a very big white pill. And here is exactly why. And I'm glad we covered this as much as we did. Go back to that first monopoly, knowledge. I think throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, our existing establishment, they got so effective and ruthless with that first monopoly, the knowledge, that I think a lot of their skills with the other with the other ones started to atrophy. If you can just gloss over all of your mistakes with the right narrative, eventually you become sloppy on all your other forms of execution. You look at all of these things they've did, all of post 2008 crisis. Now we look back at it and they go, how did they get away with this nonsense they were hawking on people? Right? And the answer is they kept people from putting together the truth and coming to consensus about it. If we transported the version of X that we have now back to 2008, that probably would have been the crash. It really, and by all rights, should have been. But they were able to keep it going with that narrative control. So
one of the things when I was talking with Stormy and looking at Tom Luongo's work, one of the things they really highlight, and which is why we can, I think, safely say that COVID had more to do with keeping financial institutions afloat and had almost nothing to do with saving grandma. It's about saving offshore banks. Is that, riddle me this then, why did the U.S. funnel out trillions of dollars to Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Bank of England, and the list goes on? Like, there's no narrative that can explain that other than the one that I'm pushing forward, which is like, this whole system is built on a very shaky house of cards, and all it takes is apparently one massive or a few massive fires to maybe push that house of cards completely over.
Well, sure. And the other thing that and this is a very under discussed point, is that the other thing COVID did was it essentially extorted all these governments, because they restricted the supply of the vaccine around the world to all these other governments, and then ended up charging and fleecing them for billions of dollars. And so there was that. But I think also, not only is it the regaining control of finance, but in a very real sense, I think they knew they were losing control of the first monopoly, to control the narrative. And COVID, to me, reads almost like a desperate attempt to hijack it back, just by creating this crisis that's going to reach down and, everybody's got a mask every day, everybody's got to do this. You're trying to create this unifying, almost religious ritual that everybody has to participate in. And in the short term, it worked, but in the long term, I think it was such an awful backfire. Oh, just awful.
I think the history will look back on this, presuming that history is not written by hostile AI. That's made a different discussion, but I think we're going to look back on that as that was the great undoing. You just red-pilled billions of people.
Sure, you mainstreamed conspiracy theories.
Absolutely.
There's a YouTuber I listen to, Mr. Z. He actually has a pretty good channel on. He talks about different different layers of politics, and he one thing he points out is, he says, within the Trump right-wing coalition that came together after 2016 and has steadily gotten stronger, he points out that there's three groups that are pretty foundational. And the first is paleo-conservatives. And that's folks who look at America as a culture. So Jimi Hendrix music and 4th of July barbecues and, Southern hospitality, those types of things as, Americana, American culture. And they think that one of the most important things is for us to unify and preserve those things, because they think it's being destroyed by wokeness. So paleo conservatives is one faction. Second faction is what he calls populists. In other words, those who think that the American or Western social contract is fundamentally broken on not just one level, but on multiple levels, and that we need to go back and we need to retool it. The traditional marriage is falling apart. The traditional family is falling apart. The traditional relationship we used to have with our employers, it used to be you worked hard and you got a raise and you stayed with the same employer, and now people have to job hop. That type of thing. You used to be able to trust that your insurance company wasn't trying to screw you, that your bank wasn't spying on you. And then the third group, he calls it, and I think this is a good term, he calls them outer ring conservatives. Those are your Alex Jones types, skeptical of big pharma, skeptical of big food, skeptical of the military industrial complex, skeptical of the intel agencies. And what COVID-19 did is go way back to the 90s, those guys were way out in left field and were everything they said was socially unacceptable because the average person simply couldn't point to an example where their life had been affected by it. And hey, those guys are right. COVID-19 effectively handed all three of those groups this permanent remember the Alamo moment where all three of them can point to this is the moment they screwed us so badly that
I mean, it was even bigger than the 2007, 8, 9 situation, because depending on where you were in the globe, I mean, I remember Canada wasn't overly affected by that comparatively to the United States and other places in Europe. So there was places in the world where, you know, when you hear about these things, you're like, huh, what? Oh yeah, that thing. Yeah, I mean, you know, things got a little shaky there for a minute. Whereas if you're in the States and you just lost your whole 401k or all your investments just went poof, or you lost your house or, you know, whatever the hell you lost, it was far more immediate and much more of a touchstone moment. The events of 2020 and the preceding years, it affected everyone on the globe. In some ways, the testament of globalization and its undoing at the same time. Because
absolutely,
because you never had a global event quite like it. Not even world wars, because there was places in the world where the world wars didn't even touch. You know, you could have wrote out the entire world war and never knew what was happening. Whereas with COVID, there was no chance of that.
I'm somewhat famous in my friend, family, and social groups for when as COVID happened and very early into it, I said that I think COVID-19 will go down in history a lot like Pearl Harbor. It will be seen as this amazing tactical victory for those that pulled it off. But in the long run, they might as well have just committed suicide.
We've covered a lot of ground. I think we can maybe do a part 2 at some point. So we didn't even really get into AI personalities, what peer-to-peer blockchain voting might look like, all that kind of stuff. So let's put a pin in that. Let's schedule something sometime soon. Now that we laid the groundwork, we can always refer people back to this conversation, and then we can get into the nitty-gritties to get into the how an AI Congress would actually function. Things to look for to see if that, we'll call it a prediction, but more of an analysis is taking place. I think I see already signs of it. I'll include that Elon clip about when he was asked, you know, who's going to win in 2030 or whatever, who's going to win the presidential election. He just kind of laughed and said, you know, which AI is going to win in 2032.
It's going to win the White House in 2024.
Who do you think will win the White House in 2032? Which type of AI? Transformers or diffusion?
So kind of give a preview of what I think that conversation is going to look like. So if we go back to the four monopolies, knowledge, I think we've already seen the breakdown and the usurping of that from the powers that be, and they know they're not getting it back. And I think we're going to see an ongoing competition between people and different AI models for control of that. Violence, we obviously know that drones are going to be a huge thing. Decentralized autonomous systems. We see some of the stuff these guys are doing in Ukraine. That's going to be the drone swarms near U.S. military bases. And some of those, by the way, were counter drone exercises where they were trying to say, what if somebody swarmed a bunch of drones? What could we do about it? So there's that. But I also think going to those last two, property and the currency, and I know some folks that are they're kind of their take on crypto is that crypto is going to become the native currency of AIs because there's going to be this massive need for microtransactions and being able to do accounting for different things and quantities of data, and crypto is the ideal vehicle for that. So I think what you're going to see with the rise of AI and its challenge to governance models is I think you are going to see all four of those monopolies challenged at the same time from different directions.
Yeah, I think it's already open rebellion in all four forms. I think the thing that holds it together, the ratio of those four monopolies, is synonymous with government itself, is authority. And as we move into this age of the vengeful sun, one of the things I think it's going to take aim at and try to just tear down and reestablish in its own image is authority. More and more men are dropping out of school or not even applying because they realize that it's no longer going to give them the authority they need. You know, you can come in with a PhD, you know, multiple PhDs and be the smartest guy ever, but you don't fit a certain profile, so you don't get hired. That energy is not going away. Those consequences of those actions of DEI, ESG, all the rest of it, even if they succeed in putting those away or getting rid of them, the effects of those programs are going to take, I mean, a generation, 2 generations, who knows, to weed itself out, not just structurally within businesses, but psychologically within the populace. One of the ways that I think that's going to be expressed is a form of total violence, where a lot of young men are going to go, "We're not here to reform it; we're here to destroy it." We shall see.
There was a very widespread meme on the World War III topic of World War III. People saying, "Oh, young men are going to be drafted," and they said, "Well, you know, what am I going to go fight for? Home, wife, kids, good job." It's like, you forgot to give me something to fight for, right? At some point, young men would rather fight for themselves than fight that conflict.
And the war is at home now. We're in for one.
Yeah, agreed. We're definitely in historic times.
All right, brother. Thank you so much. Let the people know where they can get you.
Oh, hey, I appreciate it, Jason. Yeah, the best place to find me is on X, at _emergent_. That's my main profile, but in there I have my link tree. So I do have a Substack, which is also emergentperspective.net, but that redirects to my Substack. But you can find all my links in there. There's my buy me a coffee if you want to sub on there. Sub to me on Twitter if you want to support my work. Or sub to me on Substack. Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation, and I'm looking forward to the part 2.
Absolutely, brother. Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. I am Jason Mironchuk, and it is later than you think.